Thank you for organizers, Professor Dr. Regin, Cape Comorin Trust, and all the organizers and the technical team for inviting me to present this plenary session. Uh, I would like to have my slideshow. Will it be possible now? Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so shall I begin it?
Yes, ma'am.
Just a second. Yeah, sure. So, okay, I think I can present it now, right?
Yeah.
Is it visible?
Yes, ma'am. It's visible.
Yes, okay, fine. So, the title of my presentation is Owning or Subjugated Knowledge, Indigenous Knowledge Systems under Post-Colonial Society. As we know, under this seminar, there are certain themes where we are
Ma'am, can
trying.
we have it on the slideshow mode? It will be more visible.
Okay, just a second. Let me just check it. Yeah, is it perfect now? Is
Yeah,
it okay? Yeah, sure.
exactly.
So,
Perfect.
as we know, there are certain themes which we are discussing in this conference about biocultural knowledge and practices, environmental and ecological studies, and traditional medical systems. So, based on these three different ideas, as I'm working right now on indigenous knowledge systems, and especially in terms of the traditional healing practices, so the whole concept of indigenous knowledge systems itself is a contested term because when we talk about the notion of biopolitics, because as you could see in the abstract I have mentioned, that in the beginning of the 21st century itself, the globalization and universalization of the values, lifestyles, and complex social structures evolved worldwide. And with them, there was a blending of urban and rural areas on a very different plinth. Because when we see history before the colonial era, the codependency of urban and rural areas was not about the domination. It's about the technology transfer as well as the rural or the indigenous territories catering to the resources required in the urban areas without giving away the knowledge systems of their own. So, in on the contrary, when we see the colonial times, or especially with the Industrial Revolution, the whole shift in the technology transfer happened, and therefore, what basically deprived the indigenous communities, so-called indigenous communities, was the people who are living in a particular territory with a certain knowledge of technology were have to give it away to certain capitalist urban conglomerate of the knowledge holders. So indigeneity into global cultural patterns became the idea with a flex identity cushion in the present scenario. The claimants which appeared to be indigenous often were vanguard beneficiaries of the identities classified as indigenous. Actually, in this session before, I was just discussing it with Abhijit Nihirdar about this whole concept. Because when we talk about the idea or the concept of indigenous itself, it comes from the Greek terminology of indigio or Indiano. Actually, the whole terminology indigenous itself comes from the term where the Greek and the Roman colonizers used to identify the other communities, which were especially the Oriental communities, which are not part of their culture. So indigenous has its own the general genesis and the pragmatics of the terminology. Indigenous itself is certain, hypothetically need to be redefined. But unfortunately, at present, we are dominated by the Eurocentric perceptions of knowledge. So even the terminologies need to be accepted as per their narratives. So various questions which inherently come in the global debates today are about the indigenous knowledge holders, and how we appropriately define indigenous knowledge systems, which are popularly called as IKS, or who are the knowledge holders, what are the notion, features, structures which make traditional knowledge or traditional knowledge holders actual beneficiaries of the whole banking of the indigenous knowledge systems. Secondly, does the historiography itself is sufficient to prove the assertions of those who are vanguard of IKS and TKH? Or do we need more structural and ecological percepts to identify and empower indigenes? So these are certain questions that erupt the Petian pious approach for indigeneity viable in globalized identities, or the postmodernist exclusive idea of indigeneity is more about bringing back the elite supremacy over an isolated idea of living in segregation. This is as you could see, the as you maybe like if you could read the last third last line, a postmodernist exclusive idea of indigeneity is more about bringing back the elite supremacy over an isolated area of living in segregation, because this is more about the constructing the colonial stereotypes where indigeneity is considered to be a static model of life and livelihood in a certain territory, where their contextualization with the broader society is not accepted or even denied, and they are forced to live in an isolated platform. So the this whole why this is happening and what are the motives behind doing this indigenous debate, and why there is a conglomerate of the idea of indigenous confined to the knowledge systems. This becomes a more contested debate on who will be empowered and who will be disempowered because of the indigenous idea. So, as we know, Michel Foucault, in some of one of his various one of his most important lectures on biopolitics, he said that biopolitics is an intersectional field between human biology and politics. It's a political wisdom taking into consideration the administration of life and a locality's population as its subjects. And this is ensured by sustain and multiply life to put this life in order. So, more or less, we try to understand the whole idea of biopolitics is actually about the control. Who is going to control resources, how they are going to control resources, and whom they are going to disperse these resources. And this definitely requires that who are going to be subjugated and how the subjugated resources going to be manipulated for the benefit of a certain consumer group or certain overpowering group of populations. So I'm just giving you, these are certain two very, in the contemporary scenario, these are two important images which I came across by one of the artists of the Native American Society. So we could see that uh, how the indigeneity was deprived of its own resources was the first main formulation of this whole idea, came up with the genocide. So, genocide is not just when we talk about genocide or Holocaust, it's not just about Germans doing it with Nazis. We see that every colonial power, every overpowering society actually worked with the idea of genocide. And the worst case scenario of this kind of genocide to take over the indigenous, initially the land, and later on their knowledge systems, happened with the indigenous communities all over. So when we talk about indigenous, so as we discussed in the previous slides, that indigenous is a terminology used by the Greeks and the later on Romans, who basically for the Orientalist or the Asian communities, Indio. So later on, this terminology was used wherever the colony was made, and they were defined as Indians. Especially the Americans came to American continent people came to be known as Indians because their socio-cultural practices were very much similar to that of the Asian, and especially those of the South Asians, and that made them uh, Indians. And later on, even the Aborigines of when the Aborigines, so-called Aborigines, now we definitely don't like to be term them as likewise. The Australian indigenous communities and the New Zealand in the southern Australasia or even Polynesian communities, they started defining themselves also as indigenous. The first thing which came to be known as that the first process of the deprivation of any community begins when you take over their land. And the second process, when you take over their land, the second most important to do away with them from their land is through genocide. So for that matter, different biopolitical measures were perceived, especially during the colonial era. And that too, because there were two ways of doing the genocide. One was the direct warfare, which majority of the, when we, this kind of Genocide we find when it occurs in the Asian and African continent when the intertribal wars are taking place. But the worst case scenario happened when Eurocentric colonization happened. There was a systemic genocide. There was a systemic genocide in form of different kinds of diseases and implantation. And secondly, doing away of a certain territory and completely taking over that particular territory with a new set of population which is being sent in a hordes. So that's why we find the concept of land runs, we find the concept of new city formations, where all the populations settled in those cities or town areas were not indigenous to that land. So this actually led to the disposition of the uh, space, disposition of the indigenous communities or the actual inhabitants of that region, which are living for a very long time. So therefore, when in context of India, what we see that there are certain majority of the Indians which are living today in India are indigenous to this land. So there are. It is considered that there are three ways through which they were being dispossessed, or there was a kind of a disposition for their lands. So first community remains those indigenous communities which come under fifth and sixth schedule of India. Those who could retain the land rights and they could not get dispossessed from the land of their ownership. The second communities are the ones which actually got dispossessed, but they relocated themselves, but continued there with their knowledge systems. And the third community is of those communities which were actually, um, they could not retain their land, they were dispossessed also, and they also lost their ancestral knowledge. And they were merged or they were converted into those who were actually being overpowering the social order. So these kinds of systemic genocide we find not only in India, but if we see it in the context of different parts of the world, wherever the population of that particular land was living, it was taken into consideration or underwent certain kinds of changes in all parts of either they were dispossessed or they were completely deprived of their own knowledge systems. So, so what we find, let's take, for example, the case of India. So in India, what we find that there are, as you could see in the map of India, so there are many, right now, Jammu and Kashmir, we don't have proper, perhaps we don't have the proper sacred groves details, but more or less, except in Punjab, Delhi, and Uttar Pradesh, and Bihar. So these are the actual territories of the constant invasion in India. Even when the Britishers came from Delhi to Bihar, these were the territories which were colonized first. And they were actually run down by the administrative setup of the Britishers. And this was also a major trade routes. That's why you don't find the sacred groves in those areas. But rest of all the parts of India have a we have really densely housed sacred groves. That means those places of ancestral knowledge systems or orality of knowledge and the ideas of being associated to land and space and sacred identities, which is seen in every part of India. It actually strong bonding between culture, people, and the land. So that to a certain extent defines that disposition of land and disposition of the community cultures. Even if it has happened, it has not happened to a very large extent. So so there are certain fifth and sixth scheduled tribal communities of India are those communities which have actually never got dispossessed from their land. On the contrary, the other parts of India, even if they are dispossessed, the distance between their sacred space and their dispossessed land, newly settled land, is not too far. And therefore, we find there is a linguistics and cultural affinity with the people those who are living in the close by areas to their indigenous land or the land to which they belong from the times of their ancestral well-being. This the same thing to a large extent we find that in different parts of world as well. So if you could see this indigenous knowledge systems or the defining sacred and associated belief systems to them, we find in more or less all parts of the world. The most densely, fortunately, is the India, because we find the idea of, or not only India, but in the entire South Asia. Next comes Europe. So the benefit of the grounds of Europe is that many a times the indigeneity of Europe is not to be taken into consideration. But one of the most rooted and one of the most staunchly associated to their land and culture are the Europeans, because what we find, it is the smallest continent of the world, and yet it has the maximum, some of the maximum numbers of languages and people in its own continent. And we know how much strongly each and every European nation believes in its own culture and its own traditional zone. So, of course, there are certain cultural connotations. There are more hyper narratives of being imperial, which doesn't brings out many aspects of indigeneity within Europe. But the European indigeneity has its own narratives to be shared with the entire world, and perhaps it also dominates the. Uh, it also dominates the entire knowledge sphere of the world. Therefore, we find that European indigeneity comes in different kinds of narratives, which is evident in the knowledge systems and the indigenous narratives of the global context as well. The third major section is other than Asia. We still find a major chunk of the area, major where indigenous sacred and resilience is not being is being adopted in the narratives, is the region under the former USSR or the present Russia and the Central Asian context. These territories are actually now reclaiming their indigenous sacred sites, and there are lots of movements going on, which we can always search about when we see to the literature of the different indigenous communities of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, likewise. So basically, when we talk about the knowledge systems, so it is about the resilient knowledge which is there in the ancestral knowledge and carrying legacy of indigenous knowledge systems. Because the Eurocentric or the colonial narrative never defined, or it never defined the knowledge systems of the people in their narratives. They basically defined the cultural practices through ethnographic notes, or through the um, or what we know what we define it as the political narratives of the communities and their displacement. On the contrary, what was the wisdom shared or the wisdom convened by many of the communities remain in the form of the indigenous ancestral knowledge, and that had been passed through the different maternal and paternal practices. In the context of many of the American or the indigenous communities in Northeast India, perhaps, for say, the matrilineal society had been fairly empowered for the because they passed on the knowledge through their matrilineal or the matriarchal processes. So even though they have been written in different contexts by the Eurocentric ethnographic narratives, it doesn't justify to the actual knowledge holders. And therefore, somehow this knowledge, even though they have many displacements and dispossession of the land among the indigenous communities all over the world happened, they retained their knowledge and power with them. And as a result, there are many facets to these knowledge which are becoming now more primarily important for the global knowledge bank. As a result, different conventions are now being perpetrated to acquire them. There are different categories that how we define knowledge systems and how they are going to get protected. Because of that, we have all these patent rights and IPR, intellectual property rights. But how far they are going to protect the indigenous communities of their knowledge and power? That remains a contested question. Uh, So what is happening right now, that many of these societies who are living, for example, when we can go through this slide again, that many of these societies who are still maintaining their close web network of relations and their community solidarities, because of their land, many of these are able to save there because they already have a, just like in India we have the fifth and sixth schedule, or in Americas we have nation within the nations, or even in Australia, certain areas, even in New Zealand, when you have Maoris, they are able to retain their knowledge in their community and land positions. But there are certain communities, even though they are not having a direct control of land and forest resources, but they have a strong community culture, because of which they are able to retain the knowledge in a strong ancestral knowledge formulations. So it's been a orally transmitted knowledge process, which is part of the knowledge systems, because of which their assertions have become now in this present scenario, when the knowledge is not just about owning the land and the materialistic gains, it's also about the owning the ideas. So, in the present 21st scenario, as present now, we are living in a virtual world where we don't even need a space to come together to sit and define that where we are sitting together, and we can transmit knowledge. So, that actually brought into consideration that what are these different knowledge and ideas, because inherently it comes with the knowledge which is there in everywhere. As Upanishads also say, that knowledge is the intangibility of knowledge increases its empower. So right now, majority of the indigenous knowledge is not tangible in nature. It is more into oral and memory sources. And as a result, their power, their strength remains in the community, community solidarity, and community with a valid and the structured historiographic networks of its own. And this definitely defined that how the various communities are going to assert their knowledge in the traditional knowledge holders and the indigenous knowledge systems are going to assert themselves in the neo praxis and the global political situations of the present scenario. So now, because many of these knowledge owning societies are getting more empowered, not only with the land, but also because of their knowledge systems, they are pretty powerful. They are fairly powerful to assert their notions, because they not only own financial economic stability, but they also own a say in the different system. As a result, they are reclaiming, and there is a resilience in the knowledge systems. And that we find that indigenous way, as you could see in this diagram, it's very well defined, and I've taken it from from an indigenous knowledge network. So indigenous ways of knowing, decolonized knowledge systems, and traditional museums knowledge systems. So intellectual framework to employ AR as a decolonization tool. So now the indigenous knowledge systems and the people who own this indigenous knowledge systems, because of their community status, they are reclaiming and also decolonizing the narratives which had been defining them, because their knowledge, heritage, and the new system of expressions have empowered them to redefine the way they had been continued to be stereotyped and defined by the Eurocentric ideas. As a result, indigenous way of knowing, decolonizing knowledge systems, and bringing back traditional museum knowledge of systems is a new method of reclaiming and resilient ideas. So, employing the decolonized knowledge systems. The most important thing is that we need to employ. We need to develop a counter narrative. We need to write a narrative which should be countering what has been told to, or what has been there for us or about us, and working collaboratively with the indigenous people, because the stereotypical colonial narrative of indigeneity defines that indigenous are isolated. On the contrary, the neo decolonized resilient indigenous is about working in collaboration, because that has been the pre-colonial way of living of indigenous communities as well. And that's why there is a reconsidering of museum processes, reconsidering of collection interpretation. When we talk about museum, because indigeneity is thoroughly defined by ethnography, and the museum object, because they had been defined in the colonial Eurocentric narrative as the static museum objects. So we are actually reconsidering how the museums and the knowledge was defined. We are recollecting and reconsidering the interpretation. We are analyzing the limitations in the physical place, and we are creating a virtual, immersive, decolonized narrative. As Miguel Zavella further says, that the counter storytelling, healing, and reclaiming, it is a continuous process. It's like a cog. It's a three different cogs which are continuously wheeling. And it is about practices, identities, spaces, social collective, spiritual, psychological, and naming and remembering. So it is a continuous process which is happening within the ideas of communities. There is a the what had been there as so-called indigenous for so long. The 20th first century is about redefining all these claims which were done by the superior narratives, and it is coming as counter narrative, and this is happening through healing and reclaiming the identity first. And when we say indigenous, for now, we really don't have a consensus globally that what should be the counter narrative for the terminology of indigenous itself. So right now, um, for the convenience sake, all the different communities who are actually rooted to that place all over the world are preferring the term indigenous for themselves. So, so this is how I just as we see that this is the way we look into the different aspects of indigeneity and who is going to own them. The owning of the knowledge itself is a process, like who is going to own the knowledge and who is going to govern the knowledge is a process which is ongoing in the societal terms. So this is how I try to explain things. If there are any questions, and I would definitely like to have comments, or if there are any questions pertaining to them.
Uh, is it open for
Yes,
questions,
yes,
ma'am?
definitely. Please go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. I have a question. First of all, I would like to compliment you. It was a wonderful presentation, giving us quite, uh, helping us to understand the concept of indigenous people to certain extent. However, there was a statement that you made when you talked about the indigenous people of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar when they were colonized by the British people. And you were absolutely right. Historically, they were colonized first because Goa was the region which was. So, my question here is, ma'am, you had said that no information is available on Jammu and Kashmir front.
No,
That is what I would like to know.
yeah, no, actually, I'm not saying that it is not information as such. The sacred groves are not being identified in a broader sense right now. Definitely, in fact, Kashmir, because of, we have all these political crises going on over there. So a lot of sacred groves are not, you have reservations and forest reservations and the protected forest areas in Jammu and Kashmir. But we know because of the political turbulence, the actual sacred groves which were associated to the indigenous communities of that territory. We know that there are around 12 communities who are indigenous to Jammu and Kashmir, other than those in the Ladakh area. So they certainly must be having their sacred groves areas. But perhaps it need to be investigated because, as we know, till 1990s, Jammu and Kashmir did not had a definite status for scheduled tribes and scheduled castes. Therefore, there are certain things which need to be worked out in the national scenario in areas of Jammu and Kashmir. Regarding Punjab, Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, and Bihar, we know that. I hope, Mr. Abhimanyu, I'm able to convey you because you're coming in a frozen state right now. Hello. Yeah, I think he's lagging for now.
Uh, Abhimanyu, are you there?
Yeah, I think he's lagging.
Okay, no issues. Now I can take over. Ma'am, we have lots of questions. First is how do you define indigenous people? That's in continuity, so I'll keep reading. Why the dominant migrant people ask the indigenous people to co-opt to their culture, right? Third part, can indigenous knowledge bring back emancipation to indigenous people? Fourth, how
Okay.
migrant. So I think you can.
Ideology affects the psyche of the
Yes,
indigenous people. How to
yes,
read the psyche of indigenous
psychics.
people. Yeah.
Yes, this is
So,
by Mr.
yeah,
Franz.
definitely. When we define, actually, the whole notion of indigeneity came with colonization, because prior to the Eurocentric colonization, also the entire globe was having the intertribal wars, and there was a cultural domination. For example, even in India, we had like Mongols invaded, and later on, we had the whole notion of Islamic invaders in form of Khaljis and Tughlaqs and Mughals likewise. But the most important aspect about all these cultures was that when they came to certain areas, they too defined and redefined the way the inhabitants, the native or the actual inhabitants